The cashier held my loaf of bread the way you hold something you're not sure you should touch, scanning it twice as if the barcode might apologize for me. I had already tried 2 cards and a handful of coins that didn't add up. The queue behind me shifted like a restless animal. Someone exhaled hard enough to move my hair. The manager hovered with a kind smile practiced on posters, the one for dementia-friendly hours. He didn't know me, but he thought he did. When he gently suggested I could leave the items and come back later with a family member, my cheeks burned in a way I hadn't felt since I was a girl caught with ink on a school blouse. I wanted to explain that I used to reconcile audit trails for a hospital trust, that I could smell a missing penny from the next room, that I knew exactly how much a loaf of bread should cost and what it meant when the card machine said insufficient. But my mouth did a small, old thing and said, "I'll manage, thank you," and I walked out with nothing but my cloth bag folded on my arm like a mistake. Outside, March air came in sideways off the channel and stiffened my fingers. Brighton can be cruel with wind even when the sun shows up for photographs. A boy from the estate, Callum, the one who skateboards under the viaduct and calls everyone mate, like an apology, caught up to me with an apple he had already paid for. He slid it into my empty bag without looking at me, as if the bag were a mouth and he didn't want to see the teeth. "You good, Mrs. Hart?" he asked. He calls me that because he once helped me carry cat litter home and read the name on a parcel. "Absolutely, darling," I said, and he nodded the way boys do when they don't quite believe you but won't tell on you for lying. I didn't cry. Not in the street, not on the bus, not when the driver gave me a free ride because the reader flashed red. I sat on the damp lower deck and watched terraced houses smudged by rain, watched a woman in a yellow coat run with a bouquet held upright like a torch, and planned the sensible thing. You don't work 32 years in hospital finance without knowing what to do when numbers misbehave. You put the kettle on, you take out your documents, you call the bank, you take notes. You don't start with outrage. Outrage wastes ink. At home, my flat smelled faintly of lavender and dust, a small victory considering the coast road tends to sneak in with salt. The cat, Moss, who chose me by sleeping on my doormat for 2 days and then never leaving, twined like a shoelace around my ankles until I fed him. I boiled water and lined up my statements on the table, the good table, the one with a scar from my late husband's toolbox and a small round burn where my grandson once set down a sparkler. I reached for my glasses, the brown ones I pretend are tortoiseshell because the optician's assistant said they frame my integrity, and I dialed the bank with the steadiness of a nurse pulling a curtain. "Security, blah blah," I told the polite voice, giving my maiden name and the street I grew up on. The voice approved of me. "I need to report a card decline," I said, "and some transactions I don't recognize." When you work with numbers, you learn to watch the spaces between them. I saw at once that the week my son Oliver and his wife Gemma insisted on helping with my digital life, a new standing order had been set up, £480 monthly to Carries Solutions Limited. Carries, one of those companies that sound like a warm bath but are mostly an invoice. Next to it, a tiny payment, almost shy, £2.49 to G Drive extra storage. That one is nothing unless you know that someone is stockpiling documents out of your sight. The polite voice put me on hold, and the music was a hymn I couldn't place, something my late Arthur would have hummed while bleeding a radiator. When the voice came back, it told me that the standing order had been instructed in branch, processed by a clerk number and a date. The date smelled like Gemma's new perfume, the one she wears when she plans to persuade. "I didn't authorize this," I said. "It's linked to a signed form," the voice replied, the way a digital person does when it wants to sound like paper. "Then I'd like to see the form." The voice had to check. Something in its tone changed, a slight warmth as if it noticed the posture in my words. It asked if I could visit the branch tomorrow. I could and would. I closed my notebook and underlined the date. I wrote Carries and G Drive on a sticky note and stuck it to the tin of biscuits no one was allowed to open until Sunday. Then I took a breath and let that shop floor humiliation settle inside like a stone in a shoe. You can walk on a stone for a while. It reminds you with every step that something's wrong, and that's a kind of help. I know what you're wondering. Where's my family in this careful scene of tea and underlined dates? They are present, more present than I would wish, as if I live under a magnifying lens someone keeps wiping clean. Oliver, my sensible boy with the easy grin he learned from his father, the one who still apologizes for being born breech as if that set a tone. Gemma, all angles and optimism, a project manager by nature and by contract, someone who uses words like embed and stakeholder in dinner conversation and means them. They have 2 children, Ava and Theo, teenagers with good hair and a talent for disappearing into blankets. After Arthur died 2 years ago, sudden heart attack while spooning flour for pancakes, which would have annoyed him as an untidy exit, I became a project too. They meant well. I have to believe that, or my heart will turn to limestone. At first it was the kind of fussing. They came on Sundays and changed light bulbs unasked. They ordered more sensible slippers without asking what my feet wanted. They took my phone and made the icons very large. We're just simplifying, Mum, Oliver said, and Gemma nodded as if she'd earned a certificate in it. Then came the health curry, turmeric, cumin, lectures about blood pressure. Then came the apps. An app for prescriptions. An app to book the GP. An app that told me how often I stood up. They did a little show and tell with my pills and my dates and my passwords, and I acquiesced because grief makes you polite. If your arms are busy holding sorrow, you can't always hold your ground. I warned myself not to be uncharitable. People express love in bossiness more often than in poetry. But it turned, slowly and then all at once, that I had become the family's most delicate project. The WhatsApp group was named Mum Plan. The first time I noticed that, the title made my stomach tighten like laundry wrung without a mangle. They blinked when I said it made me feel like a deliverable. Mum, it's just easier for us to coordinate, Gemma said, which is what someone says when they have already built a road through your garden. The next morning, I dressed with intent. Breathable trousers, soft cardigan, the blue scarf my granddaughter Ava pretends not to like when she borrows it. I took the bus to the bank branch on London Road, the one with low ceilings and pamphlets about retirement that show couples with matching haircuts. There's a young woman there, Priya, who has the hands of someone who plays the violin and the eyes of someone who sees too much without being seen. She has helped me before, finding a mislabeled direct debit with the patience of a teacher. When she saw me, she stood as if my presence required respect. That matters when you are old enough to be called love and darling by strangers. Morning, Mrs. Hart, she said. How can I help? I'd like to view a signed instruction for a standing order to Carrie's Solutions, I said. I had rehearsed each syllable. Rehearsal is not deceit, it's dignity with a spine. She typed, clicked, frowned lightly, then excused herself and disappeared into a room with a printer hum. When she returned, she held a photocopy of a form with my name on it and a signature that could have been mine if my hand had been cold, including a small tick in a box that allowed proxy arrangement of ancillary services. It named me as the instructing party and listed a contact number that was not mine. Do you recognize this, Mrs. Hart? Priya asked quietly. I recognize the idea of it, I said, and watched her process the answer. We need to make sure you're safe, she said, younger than she needed to be and older than her batch. She slid the paper back to me without drama, then pointed with the end of her pen at a scribble in the corner, a clerk code, and the initials G.M. She didn't say anything else. You learn, in certain jobs, to let noticing be revolutionary. On my way out, Gemma called. Her photo, curled hair, careful foundation, the smile she offers to people she is about to manage, filled the screen. Mum, she said, Oliver told me about yesterday. You should have called us from the shop. That must have been upsetting. I handled it, I said. Of course you did, she said with a brightness that dented my ear, but we don't want you worrying. We've already set up Carrie's, remember? They take care of things like this. I don't remember, I said. Her pause was brief, professional. That's okay, she said, the way you soothe a child who forgets their lunchbox. It's all in place. Oliver will pop by tonight with some papers, just updates. Nothing to sign today, just information. I heard the plural there. Papers arrive like relatives. None ever show up alone. I wanted to throw the photocopy at the nearest lamppost and watch it stick like a guilty tongue. Instead, I tucked it into my bag and walked to the bus, thinking of Arthur's habit of writing initials in the corners of things, a small act of ownership, as if he needed to mark the world to keep from floating away. G.M. could be anyone. It could be Gemma's maiden name, Morgan's, or the manager of the branch, or the ghost of a person who once delivered sandwiches. But numbers and initials are the pennies I pocket. You never know which ones will buy you a way out. On the bus, a little boy with a dinosaur hat told me I had a nice scarf and asked if Moss liked fish or chicken. Chicken, I said. He thinks fish are friends. The boy laughed as if I'd invented joy. I let his lightness sit beside me for a stop, then got off near my doctor's surgery. Not to see the doctor. To look at the notice board. The surgery's board is a village square pinned with flyers, knitting groups, cardiac rehab, scam alerts typed in fonts chosen by people who trust fonts too much. There it was, a leaflet about lasting power of attorney, done in government beige, explaining health and welfare versus property and finance. A tiny line about the Court of Protection for Disputes. A paragraph about capacity assessments. I took one and slid it into my bag with the photocopy. I don't dislike forms. Forms are maps when they are honest. That evening, Oliver arrived with the smell of rain and printer ink, which is to say he arrived as my son and as someone else's emissary. Gemma came with him, of course, with a tote bag labeled Organize in gold cursive. They made tea in my kitchen as if they lived there, which they don't, and set out biscuits I had bought myself with coins. We sat at the table and they unfolded papers like napkins at a wake. Mom, Oliver began, rubbing his thumb where his wedding ring would be if he wore it at home. We've been a bit worried. Yesterday at the shop, and last week when you asked me 3 times what day it was. It's completely understandable. Grief, well, it makes time slippy. Time is slippy, I said. But my signature isn't. Gemma, to her credit, did not blink. She slid a form toward me with the efficiency of a croupier. This is just an updated contact permission with the bank and Carrie's. It formalizes what we're already doing, helping. And this, she placed a kinder-looking booklet on top, is information about a health and welfare LPA. We're not there yet, don't worry. This is just in case. It is so much simpler to have these things settled before there's a crisis. Before, I repeated, because the word tasted like a flag planted in my living room. And this, Oliver added, producing a staple document with a table of figures, is a financial overview I put together to make sure your income and outgoings are balanced. You've been very generous with the grandchildren, and we just want to make sure you're not leaving yourself short. Generous. That was true. I like buying dance shoes and textbooks and silly socks. I like to feed people. I also like to be asked before my money puts on a coat and goes out. Did you set up a standing order to Carrie's? I asked. Oliver shifted and Gemma answered. Yes, only to cover their basic care coordination. They do appointment reminders, check-ins, that sort of thing. It's billed monthly, cheaper than ad hoc. We can cancel any time. It's from your account because it's your care. I didn't instruct it, I said. Gemma gave me her softest management face. We went with you, she said. You signed, Mum. You might not remember. It was the Thursday you had that headache. We didn't want to bother you with the admin. They're busy in branch, so we prepared everything. It took 5 minutes. You were such a trooper. I looked at the signature on the photocopy and knew that if that day existed, I had been led through it like a dog through a car wash. Not exactly unwilling, just unable to steer. And the G-drive storage? I asked. Whose documents are we keeping that won't fit in the cupboard? Oliver glanced at Gemma as if I had asked him to recall how to conjugate. That's just a convenience, Gemma said. Scanned copies of everything. So nothing gets lost. I remembered then the day my father labeled jam jars with dates and contents in a hand that grew smaller each winter. He trusted dates to survive him. He didn't live to see people tuck their lives into clouds they couldn't touch. I'm not against convenience, I said. I'm against being written into things I haven't read. Oliver sighed the sigh of a boy who doesn't want to choose between wife and mother and knows he shouldn't have to. Mom, we're not trying to control you. We're trying to protect you. We love you. There it was. The word that greases every lever. Then protect my right to say no, I said, without raising my voice. And protect my money from leaving without me. Gemma's jaw softened. Of course, she said. Of course. Let's pause the standing order until you feel comfortable. We can manage things informally for now. She said it like a concession. I heard it like an admission that the ground under my chair had shifted while I was making tea. They stayed longer than usual, rearranging my pillbox, checking the date on the smoke alarm, asking me if my freezer needed defrosting. When they finally left, the corridor outside felt larger, as if it had stretched to accommodate their certainty. I washed the cups, dried them, turned them upside down in the cupboard the way Arthur used to because he said dust likes a surface to settle on. I was tired in the way that makes the skin behind your ears ache. I put the photocopy under the sugar canister. Some people hide things under mattresses. My grandmother hid her emergency cash in the flour tin. I hide mine where I can find it without digging. At 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a calendar notification I hadn't set. Home assessment, cognitive screening, it said, scheduled for next Tuesday at 11 a.m. at my address. The sender was Carrie's. The note included, in cheerful bullet points, what to expect, friendly questions about your daily life, medication review, safety checks. There was a line in gray, with consent, a follow-up report may be shared with next of kin and GP. With consent. Consent given when? At a counter with a box already ticked. At a kitchen table with the kettle on. Consent that is a gentle slope rather than a door. I clicked more details. An attachment opened, a PDF with a logo, a contact name, Gina Morris, care coordinator, and a line in smaller print, partnered with Harborview Medical Practice. Harborview is my GP, though you cannot see the harbor from it unless you stand on the bin and lie. My hands did a little tremble that my mother called the whisper. It's the body saying hello to its animal self. I let it finish. Then I took a breath and did what I have always done when faced with a process that is happening to me rather than with me. I made a different plan. You know, I used to laugh at the idea of a paper trail in a world where everything pretends to be air. But paper still exists and people still sign it, and the wrong pen can ruin a forgery. I took out my little brass key from the dish by the door. It is the only thing Arthur ever kept secret from me in a benign way, a key to a P.O. box we used when he was consulting after retirement, so clients wouldn't know our home address. He liked the romance of it, the way a small metal door in a wall could be yours. The box was in his name, but the key is in mine now. I hadn't used it since he died. I rubbed it between my thumb and forefinger. The brass left a smell. I thought of letters and of people who send them. In the morning, I went to the sorting office and asked, with the confidence of a woman who brings biscuits to estate agents, whether I could reassign the box to my name. The clerk was the age of my daughter would be if I had one, a ghost I sometimes allow on Sundays. She checked the records, saw a note about bereavement, and brought out a form. Forms again. Always the forms. I filled it in slowly, legibly, making sure to keep my hands steady. When she handed me a stack of mail that had accumulated when we forgot to cancel it, I felt a small, guilty thrill. There were circulars, 2 catalogs Arthur would have repurposed as coasters, and 1 pale envelope with no return address and my old initials in the corner. Inside was a receipt for a consultation deposit paid to a private neuropsychology clinic. The payer's name, G. Morgans. The patient, Margaret Hart. The appointment date, next Tuesday. The purpose, capacity evaluation. I stood very still in the warm, dusty office and let the words sift through me like grain. Capacity evaluation. It is not a curse. It is a tool. But used with the wrong intention, it can be a net. I carried the envelope home like contraband, made tea with hands that wanted whiskey, and called the clinic. A recorded voice told me that Gina Morris was out with clients and that I could leave a message. I did not. Not yet. I scrolled through my phone contacts and found a name I hadn't used in a decade, Lydia Pearson, a solicitor who had once guided Arthur and me through a small dispute about a maintenance contract when a landlord tried to charge us for a lift service that didn't exist. She had a serious laugh that made you feel both chastened and safe. I called her office and was surprised when she answered herself, the way busy people sometimes do when they have not yet trained life to shield them completely. Mrs. Hart, she said, as if I were a photograph she had been fond of. It's been a while. It has, I said, and she heard something in my not voice. Solicitors are taught to hear not voices. Come in this afternoon, she said before I could ask. Bring whatever is making that sound. I put the photocopy, the clinic receipt, the LPA leaflet, the Carey's leaflet, and my brass key in my bag, added a foil-wrapped biscuit because one should never discuss war on an empty stomach, and walked to the bus with a determination I kept tucked under my scarf. On the corner by the newsagent, my neighbor Mrs. Benson, who belongs to the residence committee and everyone's business, stopped me to ask about Moss, and then slid in, like a hand through a curtain. I saw your Oliver carrying a box of files the other day, love. Big box. Looked heavy. I told him to mind his back. He said, Mum's future, in that cheerful way. He's a good boy, isn't he? He is a good boy. That is the cruelty of it. Good boys can still carry boxes full of plans. Lydia's office smelled of lemon polish and cleverness. She greeted me with a hand on my elbow, an old-fashioned courtesy that made me almost cry in relief. I laid my papers out like a meal I had cooked with whatever was left in the fridge. She read quietly, lips pressed together, fingers poised. When she finished, she tapped the P.O. box receipt with a nail painted the color of wine. This, she said, is the first thing that worries me because it suggests intention disguised as care. But we'll stay very calm. You know, Mrs. Hart, people do need help sometimes, and powers of attorney are not wicked. What is wicked is the misuse of urgency. No one should be tricked into giving away their voice while they're still speaking. I am speaking, I said. Loudly enough, she replied, and smiled. She explained the rules as if we were making pastry. The difference between a health and welfare LPA and a property and financial affairs LPA. The requirement that I have capacity at the time of signing. The importance of a certificate provider who can attest I understand. The fact that capacity is decision-specific, not a wholesale label. She said a word I would hear many times in the weeks to come, safeguarding. She said another word, a quieter one, undue influence. Do you feel unduly influenced? She asked. I feel managed, I said. I feel like a project. That is sometimes all it is. But projects have timelines, and someone seems to be rushing yours. She suggested practical steps. Freeze the standing order. Check who set up the cloud storage. Inform my GP that any capacity assessment should be initiated by me or them, not a third party with a financial interest. Write a letter, a paper letter, to the clinic, stating that I would attend only if I could bring my own witness. Contact the bank manager, not the clerk. And, if I wished, consider creating my own LPA, appointing someone who would not smother me with protection. She said this last thing as if offering a piece of cake I could refuse without hurting her feelings. Who would that be? I asked and felt the embarrassing emptiness of my answer before it arrived. She did not pity me for not knowing. Sometimes the right person is not the obvious one, she said. A friend, a neighbor, a professional. We can discuss it later. For now, I will write to Carey's and the clinic to confirm that all contact goes through me. That should slow the train. I left with 2 letters folded in a stiff envelope, my name spelled at the top with the respect letters give you. Outside, the wind had rotated, and the bus stop smelled of fish and warm chips. People were leaving the secondary school, and the girls had that loose-limbed confidence I used to try on like a cardigan in a shop, always one size too big. I wondered if any of them would be project managers one day, if any of them would manage mothers. Maybe I was unfair. Maybe this was love in a dialect I didn't speak. At home, a parcel waited by my door, my name written in a flourish that wasn't post office. Inside, wrapped in tissue like a fragile truth, was my late husband's old fountain pen, the green Parker we kept for letters that mattered, and a note in Oliver's handwriting. Thought you'd like this back. Might make signing things nicer. O.X. I sat down very slowly and placed the pen on the table. It was like being given a sword before a duel you didn't agree to fight. He was not cruel. He was making a gesture that said, "Here, Mum, we're on the same team." But the timing pinched. They wanted me to sign something. They wanted the pen to make it sentimental. Moss jumped onto the chair opposite and regarded the pen as if it might be edible. Don't you dare, I said, and he didn't, because sometimes the world listens. That night, I did not sleep much. Grief and fear are bad roommates. They argue in the kitchen and leave the light on. I got up at 3 and made tea and wrote a list long enough to anchor me. Call Priya to ask about G.M. Photocopy everything twice. Bring Lydia's letters to the post in the morning. Visit GP reception to log my preferences. Ask Mrs. Benson to save me a seat at the residents' meeting. Check my will. Oh yes, the will. Arthur and I updated it when he retired, leaving each other everything with the remainder to Oliver and a small bequest to the refuge where I once volunteered on Thursday nights, making tea for women who wore sunglasses indoors. I hadn't looked at it since he died. I brought it out of the file box and ran my finger over the clauses, remembered Lydia's old colleague who had supervised the signing, remembered the way Arthur had insisted on using the green pen because black felt morbid. I also remembered that Gemma had once joked, lightly, at a Christmas table, that wills are just suggestions if the people left behind can cooperate. Everyone had laughed because it was Christmas and the roast potatoes were perfect. I had laughed too, but something in me had folded the joke away like a napkin with a stain. At 6, I put on the radio for company and made the flat presentable for no one. At 8, I went to the post office and sent Lydia's letters registered. At 9, I walked to the surgery and spoke to the receptionist, Abby, who has tattoos that tell stories and a voice that can hush a room. I told her about the clinic and about Carrie's and about my wish that any capacity questions come from my doctor and not a private service I hadn't asked for. She nodded with satisfaction. We see this, she said. It's not always bad, but it's often rushed. I'm making a note that any third-party assessments require your explicit request. You're on the safeguarding register as self-advocating. It's a wonky term. I'll add prefers clear consent checks. That helps. Sometimes bureaucracy can be a kind cousin if you catch it on a good day. On my way back, I bumped into Priya outside the coffee shop. She was out of uniform and looked like a person whose life had laughter in it. She hesitated, then came close enough that I could smell her shampoo. I shouldn't say this, she said, but you asked about G.M. I looked up the code. That's not a person. It's a stamp we use when a form is signed off by a guidance manager, someone who authorized the clerk to proceed because the client seemed unsure. It's supposed to protect you. It can be abused. Thank you, I said, and meant it with heat. Also, she added, sliding something small into my hand the way my grandmother used to slide sweets into church palms. Someone dropped this the day the standing order was set up. We found it under the chair after you left. Lost property hasn't claimed it. If it's not yours, ignore me. It was a folded sticky note with a phone number and a name I recognized from the clinic receipt, Gina Morris. Underneath, in smaller writing, the words works with HVM practice manager, fast track for H. H could be anything. H could be Harborview. H could be heart. H could be help. I didn't give you this, Priya said, with the clarity of someone who will not be dragged into a hole for your sake. Of course you didn't, I said, and she smiled in relief that I understood the script. At noon, Gemma arrived alone, carrying a hydrangea in a pot and a quiche in a tin. She kissed my cheek and looked around as if assessing a site. Thought I'd bring lunch and brighten the place up, she said, and I let her put the hydrangea on the windowsill because it would be poor manners to exile a plant. While we ate, she kept her voice low and friendly, the way you might talk to a neighbor's dog before clipping on a lead. About the clinic, she said, it's really nothing. Just getting ahead of things. If everything's fine, then we'll have that on paper and it'll make all the admin easier later. If anything's a little off, we can get support in place. No one's taking anything from you, Margaret. This is about peace of mind. She only uses my name in full when she is laying track under my feet. Peace for whom? I asked. For all of us, she said, and the S sat on the table between us, fat as a cat. Did you coordinate with the GP? I asked. She didn't flinch. We looped them in. It's fine. And the storage. The cloud. For transparency, she said. Everything in one place. I reached into the drawer and pulled out the green pen. This is lovely, I said. Thank you for sending it. It writes very smoothly. but I won't be signing anything today. I'm going to attend the clinic with my solicitor, and we'll see then whether anything needs to be written. Until then, pause the standing order to carries. I've asked the bank to freeze it, but I'd rather we agree. Gemma didn't smash the quiche over my head. She didn't call me ungrateful. She folded her napkin neatly and placed it beside the plate as if ending a meeting on time. Of course, she said again, the most dangerous phrase in the English language. We'll pause. Absolutely. This has become complicated, hasn't it, Margaret? I don't want that for you. I want ease. Ease will have when I hold the pen because I'm writing a birthday card, not because someone has put a form in front of me, I said. I'm 71. I've forgotten what I came into rooms for since 1969. That's not a diagnosis. That's being alive. She laughed, because she is not a villain from a soap script. Fair enough, she said. I'll talk to Oliver. We'll regroup. After she left, Moss found the hydrangea too interesting, and I had to put it on top of the bookcase. I made coffee, strong, and let my hands steady on the mug. I felt almost silly for the drama I had constructed in my head. Perhaps it would be as simple as pausing the standing order and attending the clinic with Lydia. Perhaps love would be enough to plug the holes. Perhaps. At 4 o'clock, my doorbell rang. Not the double press my friends use, but a firm single note. I opened to find the postman with a thin envelope, hand-delivered, addressed to me in block capitals. He looked as if he wanted to say something and didn't. Saw your son-in-law earlier, he said, then corrected himself because there is no daughter in my family. Your son. Big day of post for him. Must be sorting things. Must be, I said, and when I closed the door, I opened the envelope carefully along the top so I could use it again, because thrift feels like control. Inside was a form from Harbor View Medical Practice. Consent to share medical information with named representatives. My name printed. A line for named representative. Already filled in, Oliver Hart and Gemma Morgans. A box ticked that allowed access to all aspects of health record and to act on behalf for appointment booking and referral. My signature, copied from somewhere, lay at the bottom like a tired fish. For a moment I thought I might sit down too fast and knock over the plant. Then I remembered Abby at the desk, her tattoos like scripts of refusal. I picked up my phone and called the practice. When she answered, I explained, calmly, that a consent form had arrived at my house with my signature printed on it and that I had not signed it. There was the kind of silence that makes your ear imagine hands being set on a keyboard with intent. Bring it in, Abby said. Now, if you can. We'll log this. We'll flag your record. We'll note potential misuse. And Margaret? She used my first name as if she were putting a cloak around my shoulders. If anyone tries to book anything in your name without you, we'll call you first. Every time. I put the form back into the envelope and into my bag with the pen, the photocopy, the clinic receipt, Lydia's letters receipts, and the brass key. My bag had become a small, padded shield. In the corridor, Mrs. Benson's door opened a crack. You all right, love? She asked. Your bell's been busy. People think we don't notice. I'm fine, I said, and she gave me the look neighbors give when they don't want to meddle, but enjoy it too much not to. I can come with you, she added, surprising us both. Only as far as the top of the road, mind. My knees are strikes waiting to happen. I'll be all right, I said, and went down the stairs with the steadiness of a woman who knows that each step is made of something more than concrete. At the surgery, Abby took the form with a nod that felt like allegiance. She photocopied it, annotated something on her screen, and gave me a small card with a number. That's our safeguarding lead, she said. If anything feels off, ring that. Doesn't have to be a drama. We like prevention more than cure. I walked home in the early evening light that Brighton does well, blue on brick, gulls arguing like old men. When I opened my flat door, Moss came running with his high little chirp, and beyond his sound there was another, softer noise. My answering machine, which I keep because some noises comfort me, was blinking. I pressed play. A woman's voice, low, unsure, spoke. Mrs. Hart, this is probably ridiculous, but my name is Nina. I clean at your son's office on Tuesdays. I found something today that I think you should see. It was under the printer by the window, looked like it fell behind. I don't know if it's important, but it felt not right. If you want to, I can drop it through your door tonight after my shift. I hope this doesn't cause trouble. My number is on the back of the paper. I'll be outside your building at 9:30 with a blue bike. If you're not there, I'll post it. I stood in my little kitchen and held the air carefully in my lungs. If you have ever put a pie in an oven and waited for it to rise, you know the feeling, the held breath, the sense that heat will either make something beautiful or burn your afternoon. I looked at the clock. 9:30 was a little while away. I tidied without moving anything, set out a saucer for Moss, boiled the kettle again. When the intercom buzzed at 9:31, I pressed the button and said, without a quiver, "Come up." The days following that first confrontation with Julian's daughter-in-law were like living under a microscope. Every small action of mine was dissected, twisted, and repeated in whispers I wasn't supposed to hear. I could sense the shift even in the way neighbors greeted me, polite but laced with pity, as if they already believed I had become a dependent burden who would soon need to be handled. That word, handled, wasn't mine. I overheard it one afternoon in the hallway outside my apartment when Juliet's voice carried louder than she intended. She was speaking to Ethan, my son, and the phrase she used still scrapes at my chest like sandpaper. Your mother has to be handled before she ruins our plans. I was carrying groceries then, the bag heavy with potatoes, flour, and canned goods. My hand trembled so violently that the bag tore, sending tins rolling across the floor. Instead of rushing to help, they pretended not to notice, continuing their conversation in hushed tones. I bent down alone, gathered the cans, and returned to my apartment with my ears ringing. I placed everything carefully in the cupboard, shut the door, and pressed my palms against the counter until the dizziness passed. Juliet soon discovered more ways to make me feel small. She commented on my clothing during a family brunch, how I always wore the same faded cardigan, how I smelled of mothballs. It was said with a laugh, loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. I excused myself to the restroom and stared at my reflection, trying to see what they saw. Was I becoming that image of the old woman she wanted everyone to believe I was frail, outdated, clinging to things past their time? The truth was simpler. I lived carefully, I reused. I avoided spending needlessly. That cardigan had been bought with my first proper wage decades ago, back when I worked nights at the local library. Every stitch held memories of carrying boxes of returned books, balancing the accounts by hand before computers did it faster. I had lived long enough to know the difference between something worn out and something still useful. But in Juliet's world, everything had to be shiny and new, purchased on credit if necessary. At another gathering, this time Ethan's birthday, Juliet deliberately served me last, after the children. The slice of cake placed on my plate was half the size of everyone else's. It wasn't hunger that made my hand shake as I lifted the fork, it was the knowledge that each small cruelty was a performance staged for the benefit of those watching. She wanted me diminished in their eyes, and Ethan, sitting beside her, let it happen. I felt the sting of community judgment too. At the small grocery store where I had shopped for years, I noticed the cashier giving me sympathetic glances, as though she had heard whispers of me being too stubborn to downsize. In the post office line, two women behind me spoke openly about how selfish older people were for keeping large apartments when young families needed space. I turned my head slightly, and one of them flushed red, realizing I had heard. She muttered a quick apology, but the damage was done. I walked home slower than usual, dragging each step. Then came the first sign that what Juliet and Ethan were plotting had official weight behind it. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the bank. I opened it at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. My hand grew colder with each line I read. The letter informed me that a request had been made to add a co-signatory to my savings account for assistance with management due to advanced age. My name was printed at the top, but beneath it in bold letters was Ethan's. The form included a space for my signature, already marked with a yellow sticker indicating where I was meant to sign. My throat closed. I hadn't requested this. Nobody had asked me. I pressed the paper flat, examined the wording again, and saw it. Small text at the bottom noting that if the form wasn't returned within 30 days, the request would automatically be processed as approved. A trap disguised as convenience. I placed the letter back in its envelope and slid it into the drawer beneath the cutlery tray. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake listening to the pipes creak, replaying every sign I had ignored, every smirk, every whispered conversation. They weren't just humiliating me. They were building a case, step by step, to take away control of my life. The next blow came swiftly. Juliet invited me to lunch under the pretense of catching up. She chose an expensive bistro downtown, a place I would never normally enter. She ordered a salad and sparkling water, while I picked the cheapest soup on the menu. Halfway through, she leaned forward with that bright smile she reserved for manipulation. "You know, Aura, Ethan and I have been talking. It's dangerous for you to keep living alone. You might fall or forget to turn off the stove. Imagine if the building caught fire." I set my spoon down and met her eyes. I've lived in that apartment for more than 30 years without a single accident. She ignored my reply, continuing with rehearsed ease. "There's this wonderful residence on Willow Street. All meals included, medical staff on site. You wouldn't have to worry about anything anymore." I realized then that this lunch wasn't about catching up. It was a sales pitch. When I didn't agree, her expression hardened, though her tone remained syrupy. "Think of it as a gift, Aura. We'd handle everything for you. You deserve to rest." The word gift sent a shiver down my back. That evening, I researched the Willow Street residence. It wasn't the warm community she had described. It was a minimal facility known for cutting corners, with shared rooms and understaffed care. The online reviews were full of horror stories. They wanted me hidden away cheaply while they moved into my apartment. I printed the reviews and tucked them into the same drawer as the bank letter. I didn't yet know what to do, but I knew I needed to keep evidence. The humiliations escalated with precision. Ethan began repeating Juliet's words as if they were his own ideas. He told me during one visit, "Mom, it's selfish to keep such a large place when you're just one person. Think about families who need homes like yours." I looked at him long. My son who once cried when I left him at kindergarten, who used to hug me fiercely after football practice. Now he spoke to me like a stranger reading lines from a script. That night, I felt the weight of my worst fear, becoming a burden. I imagined neighbors shaking their heads, whispering that I should have stepped aside for the younger generation. I imagined Ethan believing that lie until it became truth in his mind. My chest ached with shame. Then the next letter came, this time from a notary office. It invited me to discuss options for property transition planning, wording vague enough to sound benign. But the sender's name at the bottom was the same lawyer Juliet's family had used for years. I hadn't requested this. They were moving faster now, tightening the circle. I placed that letter alongside the others, each document a piece of their scheme. I sat in my armchair, staring at the small pile, my mind racing. How many steps away was I from losing everything: my apartment, my independence, even my access to my own money? The cliffhanger came the next morning when I stepped out to collect the mail. A neighbor, Mr. Callahan, a quiet retired accountant, intercepted me. He held out an envelope I hadn't yet noticed in the box. His eyes flicked toward my door and back to me. "You might want to read this carefully," he said in a low voice before walking away. The envelope was thin, the paper official. My hands shook as I carried it inside. Inside was a notice of guardianship application. Someone had formally requested that the court evaluate whether I was capable of managing my own affairs. And the petitioner's name was printed clearly at the top, Ethan Hughes. Nina was smaller than I expected, slight in a dark jacket with a hood pulled up despite the mild evening, a blue bike helmet hanging from her handlebars by its straps. She stepped into my hallway as if into a courtroom, eyes moving to the edges first, checking for witnesses. I closed the door and led her to the table where I had already laid out 2 mugs and the tin of biscuits, a small stage set for honesty. She did not sit until I did. She placed an A4 envelope between us with a care that made my stomach tighten, and then kept her hands flat on either side of it as if to show she was leaving them open. "I don't want trouble," she said quietly, though there was no one to overhear. "I clean the offices on Tuesdays and Fridays. They all know me. I like the work. I keep my head down. But I saw this, and it felt wrong. I thought if it were my mom, I'd want someone to tell her. You did the brave thing, I said, and meant it without decoration. May I? She nodded. Inside the envelope was a printed stack clipped at the corner. The first page was a spreadsheet grid with color cells, a project plan exported from some software with a cheerful name. At the top, in a header, was Mum Plan, Workstream G, and the owner listed as G. Morgans. The columns showed tasks, owners, dates completed, and status flags. The tasks were short but clear. Setup so to see. Schedule home assessment, friendly. Bank consent form signed in branch prepped. Clinic, capacity check deposit paid. GP consent to share sent. Cloud folder structure set. Assess will copy, locate solicitor. Harbor view, contact PM to fast track for H. Notes in some rows made my mouth dry. N, confused re, Thursday headache, proceed. Use green pen to ease signature. If pushback, guardianship petition draft with PM. Social narrative, safety, not control. The final row in bold carried a target date 2 weeks away and a task name that was not a euphemism, Move M, to Willow Court, Temp, Pack Flat Key. Each item had either a green tick or a yellow circle waiting for a tick. Next to GP consent, someone had typed signed scan to drive, and my name was spelled without the extra middle initial I always include, which told me they had copied a signature rather than watched me write one. Beneath the plan was an email thread printed from Oliver's work account. He and Gemma had not written to each other. They had used a shared address, FamilyOpsAt, with aliases, as if disguising the choreography would make it less obvious. The emails were careful. They marked off updates after visits with me. M on board with simplifying. Standing order activated in branch. Used GM sign-off to minimize time. Clinic scheduled. M will need a hand to recall details. G to accompany. HVMP. M says yes to friendly cue from Carrie's. After capacity check, discuss LPAHNW with Lydia's type as alt blocked, and the last line there carried a striking phrase, we present support as gift. It was exactly the word that had stuck in my throat. The third section in the bundle was a set of invoices from Carrie's with descriptions that were more revealing than they realized. Onboarding consult, with next of kin present scope of services, appointment coordination, medication oversight, home safety recommendations, liaison with GP and private clinicians, family reporting. The invoices referenced my address, though they listed a contact email that wasn't mine. The sender on each was Gina Morris. I found them in the print tray, Nina said, tapping one of the pages. He must have hit print accidentally. People do that. The printer at the end by the window is the one that catches what shouldn't be caught. I tucked them under the tray when I heard someone coming and then waited until the corridor was clear. I know it isn't right to look at other people's papers, but this wasn't a payslip left behind. This looked like administration of a person. It is, I said, and put a hand on the stack to stop myself from trembling. It is the administration of me. There's more, she said, and slipped a memory stick from her pocket. I didn't plug it into anything there, so it's clean. But when they set up that cloud thing, they emailed each other the folder link and pasted it into a note. I took a photo of the screen with my phone. I typed the link at the library and downloaded copies of what I could before it locked me out. Please don't ask me to forward anything from my personal email. If this gets back to my manager, I'm finished. I won't, I said. You've already done more than enough. Let me make you tea you'll actually drink rather than hold. She shook her head. I can't stay. If I'm gone too long, they worry in the building. I didn't tell anyone I was coming here. I wrote my number on the back of the first page. Burn it after you save it. I won't pick up if it's a time I'm usually at work. Text me and say Moss at the start if it's urgent, and I'll find a quiet place. I don't want to lose my job, but some things you can't step over. She stood, already halfway gone. I followed her to the door and put my hand on her sleeve. You've risked yourself for a stranger, I said. That's a kind of citizenship we don't see often enough. If anyone asks, you never came here. If no one asks, you still never came here. Thank you, Nina. Her eyes filled quickly, caught by surprise. My Nan raised me, she said. She used to say that if you see a tide coming for someone, you shout before it reaches their feet. I'm shouting. When she'd gone, the flat felt both larger and smaller. I sat with the papers and made myself read every line. I took slow photos with my phone. I plugged the memory stick into the old laptop with no cloud sync and copied its contents to an external drive I keep in a biscuit tin under the sink. The folder names themselves were the cautionary tale. Mum, finance. Mum, health. Mum, move. In finance, there was a PDF of the very bank form that had arrived earlier, the co-signatory request, but in their version the signature box was already overlaid by a scan of my name, cropped and placed to fit. In health, there was a draft of a capacity assessment referral letter that used sentences about me that didn't belong to me. Mrs. Hart has shown increasing confusion about medication and dates, it said. She has been misplacing items and repeating questions. I stared at the screen until a hum started behind my eyes. I knew where those sentences came from. They came from the evening after Arthur's death when I asked Oliver twice when the plumber would come, and from the time I put my glasses in the sugar canister by mistake. Normal lapses recruited as evidence. I called Lydia and told her what had arrived and what Nina had brought. She asked me to come in first thing with originals and copies. We'll seal the edges, she said, and I knew what she meant. There are ways to present facts so that their outline cannot be easily sanded away. And Margaret, she added, do not confront them tonight. Let our letters arrive first. We need to widen the audience. When people plan things in the dark, they rely on the corridor being empty. I slept between alarms. In the morning I dressed as if for a job I wanted to keep and took 2 buses to Lydia's office. She read in silence, the kind that respects the material. Then she printed 2 more letters. One went to Harborview's practice manager, not Abby, but the person above her, referencing what I had received and attaching the forged consent so that even a cautious reader would understand this was not an old misclick. She used phrases that have weight: withdraw all third-party access, note of concern for undue influence, safeguarding referral initiated by client. The other letter went to Carrie's and the clinic, stating that any contact purporting to coordinate services for Mrs. Hart must cease until her solicitor's consent is obtained, and that any data gathered without explicit, contemporaneous consent might form part of a complaint to the Information Commissioner's office. She sent copies to the GP and to the bank branch manager, and added a line I admired in its straightforwardness. Please be aware our client intends to make subject access requests to all entities named for full disclosure of correspondence and access logs. We will submit the SARS today, she said, and I liked that she used the plural we for labor rather than possession. They have a month to respond. Most will respond faster if they suspect a regulator is watching. Meanwhile, we apply friction. Friction saves lives more often than people think. They'll be angry, I said. They will be inconvenienced, she corrected. We discussed options for a lasting power of attorney of my own. She did not push. She simply explained that not choosing is also a choice that leaves a vacuum for others to fill. I thought of Nina's voice at the door and Mrs. Benson's eyes watching the corridor and Abby's hands on the keyboard. I thought of Oliver's thumb rubbing his absent ring. If I appoint anyone, I said, it will be someone who has nothing to gain and something to prove to themselves about fairness. There is also the option of appointing me or a professional deputy in the future if required, she said. People worry it's impersonal, but sometimes a person without family ties is the most humane. For now, I said, let me hold my own pen. For now, that is exactly what we are doing, she said, and smiled properly. On my way home, I stopped at the surgery and asked Abby to witness me handing over Lydia's letters for the practice manager. She didn't read them, but she glanced at the headers and nodded with satisfaction. I've already placed a hard note on your record that the previous consent was not signed by you, she said. Any call from a third party triggers an alert to call you directly. You will get sick of hearing from us, but better that than the other thing. At the residence committee meeting that evening, Mrs. Benson kept a chair for me with a cardigan slung over it like a reservation sign. When we discussed the new bins protocol and a man from the second floor made a speech about how older residents were always leaving recycling in the wrong stack, Mrs. Benson cleared her throat and said in her theater voice that everyone, young and old, seemed capable of confusing a triangle with a circle and that perhaps the solution was bigger labels. People laughed in a kind way. Afterwards, while the custard creams were being redistributed, she leaned close and said, "I heard a rumor there's to be a meeting about new emergency fobs, only issued to next of kin to avoid misuse." That doesn't sound like us, does it? It sounds like someone is trying to install a key in my life, I said. We like keys to remain with the doors they fit, she replied, and I understood it as an offer to come with me to any meeting where someone planned to hand me a solution. When I got home, there was a message on my phone from Oliver asking if he could stop by the next day to talk, properly without emails. I told him yes, and that he could come on his own. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji and then the words, "Jem can come for 10 minutes at start?" I wrote back, "You first." He didn't argue. That should have prepared me for the way he arrived, but it still startled me that he came carrying takeaway coffee as if it were an olive branch and stood in my doorway like a boy about to confess to breaking a window. "Mum," he began before his coat was off, "everything's gotten out of hand. We've been trying to make sure you're looked after. It wasn't meant to be sneaky. It's just that paperwork is heavy and you have a lot on your plate." "It becomes sneaky when signatures appear that I didn't make," I said. "That form at the GP," he said quickly, eyes flicking to my counter where nothing lay. "That wasn't me. I mean, I brought the form because Carrie's said it would speed things up, but I didn't fill your name. Jem might have, thinking it was helpful. We thought you were fine with it. You seemed fine on Sunday when we discussed the app and the reminder calls. I was fine with reminders. I was not fine with a document that allows someone else to speak to a doctor about my insides without me." He took the coffee lids off and placed the cups down, lining them up as if alignment might soothe. "The standing order was my idea," he said. "Carrie's charged more ad hoc. Monthly worked out cheaper. We thought we'd try it a month and see if you liked it. The bank said it needed an in-branch signature, so we made an appointment. It was a busy day at the branch and you had a headache, remember? They had the paper ready. The clerk said you could tick the ticked box or not. You ticked, Mum. Maybe you don't remember. I wouldn't blame you, it was cramped and noisy. I remember the exhaustion of other people's certainty," I said. "I don't remember being told what proxy arrangement of ancillary services meant. If I had, I would have asked why a service needed a proxy when the person is present." He rubbed his eyes. "We messed up the explanations. I can see that. But you're escalating it with lawyers and GP records. That makes it look like we're the enemy. We're not." "Then stop acting like it's a project," I said, and slid the printed spreadsheet across the table. He stared at it in that paralyzed way that tells you someone has recognized the object and is choosing between denial and admission. His eyes went to the header, and then to the notes, and then to the line about Willow Court. His face changed, not into guilt exactly, but into something worse, a frightened calculation about how many steps could be walked back. "Where did you get this?" he said. "Does it matter?" I replied. "It's not as it looks," he said, which is the sentence people reach for when the surface finally shows the pattern underneath. "It's a list of things to keep track of. We're busy. If we don't write things down, they don't happen. Jem is good at organizing. She's the one who can talk to people. I'm not good at that part. The Willow Court thing was just an idea in case of hospital discharge in the future. Not now." "Then why give it a date?" I asked, "and why call it move? Why not call it look at brochures and complain about prices?" "You're angry," he said, as if naming it would make it shrink. "I am occupied," I said. "Occupied with preventing my life from being moved like a cupboard." He reached across, not to take my hand but to move the spreadsheet a fraction, as if by adjusting its position he could adjust the facts. "I'll talk to Jem," he said. "We'll stop everything. We'll cancel Carrie's. We'll delete the cloud. We'll keep the clinic appointment because it's booked, but only if you want it, and only with your solicitor. And I'll email the bank and the GP and say nothing goes forward without you. We'll do all of that today. You will write it," I said, "and copy my solicitor. And you will also tell me why Gina Morris can get a friendly queue at my GP. Who is paying for the friendliness?" He looked genuinely confused at that, and a small piece of me put aside a grain of blame. "I don't know who Gina is," he said. "I only spoke to a receptionist and then to a man called Peter at the GP who said their practice manager would be in touch. Jem knows the names. She set up Carrie's because she knows the woman from a networking lunch. I didn't think about the overlap. I should have. I will now. Jem sent me my own husband's pen as a gift, I said. When you know someone's hand has signed the letters that made your life, you don't hand that pen to them to make them soft for a new kind of signature. He winced, as if he'd sat on something sharp. That was me, he said. I thought it would be nice. I didn't think of it as a lever. That is how levers work, I said, and felt the exhaustion arrive, heavy and undeniable. He stayed an hour. He wrote the emails while he sat there, reading them aloud before he sent them, and my phone pinged with copies to Lydia's inbox. He canceled the standing order on his banking app and sent me a screenshot of the confirmation. He wrote to Carrie's to end the account and to request copy of all data they held, and he wrote to the clinic to confirm that I would be accompanied by my legal representative and that any report would be sent only to me unless I said otherwise. He wrote to the GP to confirm that he had not obtained valid consent and to apologize for any confusion, asking them to destroy the prior form. He did not weep or beg. He did not blame me. He looked like a person who had been swept up in a competence tide and now realized it had been dragging him toward rocks. When he left, he hugged me longer than he usually does and whispered against my hair, I thought I was helping. I think I was also helping myself. I am sorry. After he had gone, the flat was not quiet. It sounded like a tap turned low. Relief and dread were running at once. I made a list longer than I care to admit and then threw it away because lists are not what you want to remember when you die. Instead, I called Lydia to tell her what had been said and sent her the emails. She replied that she would hold them in a bundle for later and that they were good in both tone and content, useful to show intent had shifted. She also warned me that apologies do not undo systems already in motion. Expect two things, she said. First, an attempt by someone in the chain to proceed regardless, using momentum as justification. Second, a quiet deletion somewhere. Make copies of everything you can in the next 48 hours. Screenshots are better than nothing. Original files are best. There is a clinic appointment, I reminded her. I still want to go. I want to know the state of my mind from someone who isn't trying to build an argument. And I want you there because I will not let my words be paraphrased into something that suits a form. We'll attend, she said. And at the start we'll confirm the scope. Cognitive screening is not capacity declaration. They try to merge the two. We will hold the line. The evening before the appointment, I went through drawers like a woman moving house in place. I found the folder with Arthur's old correspondence with Lydia and slipped it back where the sugar canister sits, because that is a place my hands go without thinking. I printed the emails from Oliver and stapled them in chronological order. I burned the scrap with Nina's number as she had asked, then wrote the number into the back of my old address book among names of people now dead, because that is where safe things live in my life. I wrote Moss Urgent next to it and underlined once. At the clinic reception the next day, the waiting room chairs were too low and the coffee machine too proud of itself. A cheerful poster reminded patients that early screening saves confusion later, as if confusion were a laundry stain you want to treat before it sets in. Lydia arrived with a satchel and a face that belongs to someone who can dismantle a process with 4 words. When Gina Morris appeared, I recognized her voice from the phone messages. She was younger than I'd imagined, neat suit, badge clipped centrally. She smiled professionally and then genuinely, as if her face couldn't decide which mask to try first. Mrs. Hart, she said, extending a hand, I'm Gina. Thank you for coming in. With me today is Dr. Patel, our consultant. We'll keep this light. I understand your solicitor is joining you, which is absolutely fine. We like to do the right thing by everyone. Lydia shook her hand and did not overdo the friendliness. Before we begin, she said, please confirm that today's session is a cognitive screen only and that no capacity declaration will be made nor any report released to third parties without Mrs. Hart's written instruction. Please also confirm whether Carrie's has any commercial arrangement with this clinic beyond referral convenience. Gina's smile adjusted half an inch. It's only a screen, she said. No declarations are made here. And as for arrangements, we have professional relationships with a number of services for signposting. We don't receive referral fees. We keep things squeaky clean. We will take your word for that and seek written confirmation, Lydia said evenly. The screen itself did not feel hostile. Dr. Patel asked me to remember 3 words and draw a clock and spell a word forwards and backwards and subtract 7s. He asked me to talk through my day and to list current medications and to name the current prime minister, which I did, and then added that it might not be the same by the time we reached the bus stop. He asked if I felt safe at home. I said yes, with a pause long enough that he wrote something. He asked if anyone had pressured me to make financial decisions. I said yes, and then described with care what pressure looks like when it is dressed as care. He listened better than most. Lydia said very little, and that, too, was care. At the end, Dr. Patel thanked me and said I had performed within expected ranges for age, and that any mild lapses reported sounded commensurate with grief and ordinary distraction. He would write up the screen and send it to me. Gina stood, gathered her tablet, and added in her bright voice that if I ever wanted light touch support, Carrie's had wonderful staff for weekly check-ins, and that many clients found the reassurance priceless. Lydia nodded as if to an advertisement on the bus. At reception, while Lydia arranged to receive the report directly, Gina leaned toward me in a lower voice. "We only ever want to support families," she said. "If your son and daughter-in-law are overenthusiastic, it's because they're worried. They don't want to slip into crisis mode. You wouldn't want that either." "I have lived more years in crisis than you have had birthdays," I said, not unkindly. "I know the difference between worry and a timetable." "Of course," she said, the word people pick when they mean nothing, and I watched her go. Back at home, I found a hand-delivered note under my door. It was from the bank branch manager, not Priya, and it invited me to meet in her office the following morning to discuss assurances regarding safeguarding. It was a good sign. When banks begin to worry about their own exposure, they become suddenly brave on your behalf. I called Lydia and she said she would attend if I wanted, but I decided to go alone and bring notes back. Part of this work had to be mine or it would not feel like mine at all. The meeting at the bank was brisk and respectful. The manager, a woman with a no-nonsense haircut and a habit of pressing her lips together after a sentence as if to seal it, apologized for any process that had moved without my clear understanding and stated that a flag had been placed on my accounts requiring in-person verification for any new instructions. She confirmed that the guidance manager stamp had been used on the day of the standing order and said that while it was intended as a protective measure in cases of uncertainty, it required stronger justification than had been recorded in the notes. She also handed me a printout of the clerk's log entries, which showed the initials of the clerk who had served us and a one-line narrative. Client accompanied by son and DL, appeared tired, agreed to pre-prepared standing order as part of care support. Ticked proxy box. I asked for a copy, and she gave it without hesitation. "If anyone seeks to be added to your account," she said, "we will call you in the branch to verify, and we will not proceed in branch if you arrive appearing exhausted. You have the right to be served when you are ready rather than when a process wants you to be ready." On my way out, I saw Priya on the customer floor and gave her a small nod that carried more gratitude than I could say aloud. She smiled back with her eyes only, and then corrected a decimal point for a man at the counter who was counting coins. The days that followed were not quiet. Small victories came in the post. The GP sent a letter confirming the destruction of the previous consent and enclosed a simple form with bold text stating that I had requested my records be shared with no one without my explicit written permission on a case-by-case basis. Carrie's replied to say my account had been closed and attached a data summary with call logs and appointment notes for 1 week only, which meant there was more they had not sent. Lydia filed the subject access requests and included requests for audit logs showing who had accessed my data and when. The clinic posted a copy of the screening with a cover letter stating I had exhibited no significant cognitive impairment and recommending, if appropriate, grief counseling, which felt like the first humane document in a pile of instruments. In the middle of this, the building's fire alarm sounded one afternoon and I joined the stream of neighbors down the stairs, passing Mrs. Benson on the half landing as she lectured a young man in a hoodie about the importance of closing stairwell doors. On the pavement, people talked about the smell of burnt toast and someone's fallen ironing board, and over that small crowd I saw Gemma standing at the end of the street with a phone raised, as if photographing the building. When she spotted me, she dropped the phone to her side and came toward me with a smile preloaded. "I heard the alarm," she said. "I was on my way to see you. Thought I might as well check you were out. Everything okay?" "Everything is fine," I said. "I wanted to apologize," she said, eyes on my face in the earnest way of someone performing sincerity. "I pushed too hard. I like a plan. It's my nature. I thought we could run you like a project and end up with a better outcome than the mess I saw with my gran. But people aren't projects. I see that now. You've always been independent. I admire that. I want to support you in the way you want, not the way that suits my spreadsheet. I have known Gemma long enough to recognize when she is telling the truth and when she is telling the version of the truth that will open the next door." There was truth in her words, but behind it I could see the shape of her fear. She was not primarily afraid that she had hurt me. She was afraid that the documents would become witnesses in a room where she did not set the agenda. "Then here is how you support me," I said. "You do not contact my GP or any service using my name without me. You do not initiate movement of my money. You do not put deadlines into my life. If I need you, I will call. If you want to be kind, you may bring the grandchildren round on Sundays and leave your phone in your bag." She nodded with relief, which told me she had expected conditions heavy with punishment rather than simple boundaries. "Of course," she said, and I nearly smiled at the favorite phrase of the compliant. "Gemma," I added, because I wanted to see whether her face could bear it, "who is Gina to you?" She did not flinch. "We met at a carers' breakfast hosted by Harborview," she said. "She's good at her job. She knows the system. People like her will run the world one day because they actually do things. But I've told her to back off. It's your call now." "It always was," I said. That evening I received an email notification that the cloud folder Mum Finance had been deleted by Morgans. A minute later another notification arrived showing restoration by O'Hard, and then a third that said folder moved to trash by owner. Lydia called me before I could call her. "Do not panic," she said. "I anticipated deletions. I had an automated script polling the folder every hour since you sent me the link. We have most of it. A deletion after a subject access request is exquisite self-sabotage. I will write to them reminding them of their legal obligation to preserve data related to a request and to any potential complaint. Panic is what they are counting on. We offer procedure instead." I sat very still with the phone warm against my ear and imagined, not with poetry but with a clear diagram in my head, the shape of the public moment that would have to come. Not an explosion. Not a bright revenge. A room where facts have to hold. A setting where a witness can be heard. The residence committee offered one kind of public, but that was gossip. The GP waiting room offered another, but that was private by necessity. A wedding oral reading would be too theatrical for this, and besides, I had no desire to turn my life into a show. I needed a space where showing my papers would have effect beyond embarrassment. I thought of the bank, but money is not the only lever people use. Then I thought of a place most people never want to enter unless forced, the county court. Guardianship applications have hearings. People have to attend and explain themselves with the clock ticking loudly in everyone's head. It would not be my choosing to stand there, but if someone had already filed papers, perhaps that was the room where this would end. I did not have to imagine for long. 2 days later, while I was putting a second coat of paint on the skirting board behind the bookcase, because marks annoy me, there was a knock at the door. It was not a neighbor's knock. It was a measured 3-beat knock that speaks of a list. When I opened it, a man stood with a canvas bag and a badge that said Court Messenger. He confirmed my name and handed me a sealed package with a cover sheet printed in capital letters. Application for appointment of Deputy, Property and Affairs, urgent consideration requested. The petitioners' names were there in tidy type, and they were the names I knew as well as my own. I turned the page and saw the grounds stated in full, including sentences copied from the draft referral letter I had found in their folder, and there, near the bottom, was a proposed hearing date brought forward to the coming week and a reference to a supporting statement from a care coordinator, whose signature I did not recognize, but whose job title I did. I read to the end twice, and then looked up at the messenger and asked him to wait while I signed the receipt so my hands would have something lawful to do. When the door closed and his steps faded on the stairs, my phone vibrated on the table, and when I picked it up, I saw a new email alert with the subject line, "Clinic report accessed by third party, audit note." And before I could even open it, there was a second alert that said simply, "Attachment removed." The court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, inside a municipal building where I had once stood proudly to register Ethan's birth. That memory pressed against me like a bruise as I walked through the revolving doors, clutching the folder I had prepared with Mr. Callahan's help. The marble floor was slick beneath my shoes, my heart steady but heavy. I had dressed carefully: navy skirt, crisp blouse, hair tied back, not for vanity, but because I knew appearances would matter. Juliet would come polished, Ethan would stand tall, and I could not afford to look like the fragile woman they wanted to paint me as. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, its wood panels dull with age, the air faintly musty. I sat at the petitioner's table, facing the judge's high bench, my palms flat against the cool surface. Juliet swept in moments later, her heels sharp against the tiles, Ethan behind her looking pale but determined. She wore a fitted cream suit, her makeup understated, her hair arranged to project respectability. To outsiders, she could have been mistaken for the concerned daughter-in-law fighting to protect an aging mother-in-law from decline. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with an unreadable expression, entered briskly. Everyone rose, then sat again. Papers shuffled, voices murmured, and then silence settled. The case title was read, "In the matter of guardianship for Aurora Hughes." The words stabbed at me like a needle. Guardianship. As if I were a child again, incapable of signing my own name. Juliet began her testimony with an easy, sympathetic tone. She spoke of her deep concern for my safety, how she and Ethan had noticed disturbing forgetfulness and inability to handle complex matters. She cited the time I forgot to lock my door overnight, an incident that had happened once in 30 years. She mentioned a misplaced payment for the electricity bill, which I had already rectified the following day. Each small imperfection was dressed up as evidence of decline. Ethan confirmed her points, though his voice wavered. He repeated her words, not his own, and I could see him shrinking inside the suit Juliet had likely chosen for him. My son, my own blood, was building the case to strip me of independence. My throat ached, but I stayed still, letting the weight of their lies gather. When my turn came, I rose slowly. My voice was quiet at first, but steady. I explained the bank letter, the notary notice, the unsolicited guardianship petition. I placed copies of the documents before the judge. Then I opened the folder and slid forward the sheet that Mr. Callahan had helped me prepare, a list of every transaction Ethan and Juliet had attempted on my accounts, flagged as unusual by the bank. Each withdrawal attempt, each transfer request, recorded in black and white. The judge leaned forward, scanning the lines. Juliet's face stiffened, the careful mask of concern cracking at the edges. She interjected quickly claims of miscommunication, clerical mistakes, attempts to paint it all as harmless errors. But her voice grew sharper, less controlled. I waited until she finished, then produced the final piece of evidence. A printed screenshot from the building's security cameras. The footage, obtained through Mr. Callahan's quiet persistence, showed Juliet rifling through my mailbox on the very morning the guardianship application notice had arrived. Her hand slipped the envelope into her bag before she noticed another neighbor watching, at which point she returned it hastily. The judge's eyes flicked from the page to Juliet, whose face drained of color. There was a ripple through the courtroom, spectators murmuring, the clerk adjusting her glasses, Ethan shifting uncomfortably in his chair. For the first time, I felt the balance tilt. The judge called for order, then turned her gaze to Juliet. "Do you deny this is you in the footage?" Juliet swallowed hard, her lips parting and closing without sound. Finally, she managed, "It must be a mistake. I only wanted to help." The judge's expression remained neutral, but her eyes hardened. "We will take a short recess." As the gavel struck, chairs scraped back and people began filing out. I sat frozen for a moment, my hands gripping the folder. I had shown my cards, but the game was not finished. I could see Juliet whispering furiously to Ethan near the doorway, her nails digging into his arm. He looked trapped, his eyes flicking toward me for the briefest moment before he followed her out. When the recess ended and we reconvened, the air felt heavier, charged with tension. The judge resumed her seat, her voice firm. She announced that further investigation would be required before any guardianship ruling could be made, citing significant concerns about possible financial motives. It was not victory yet, but it was the first time the law had spoken in my favor. Then something unexpected happened. As we left the courtroom, a woman approached me. She was in her early 40s, dressed plainly, her hair pinned back. She introduced herself quietly as Anna, a clerk at the notary office where Juliet had arranged the property transition documents. She said she had been following the case from the sidelines and could not keep silent any longer. She had copies, real, certified copies of the original forms Juliet had attempted to file. They showed clear alterations, my supposed signature shaky and inconsistent, added in a different pen. She pressed the envelope into my hands quickly, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being seen. "I could lose my job for this," she whispered, "but it's the right thing to do." I thanked her, clutching the papers as though they were lifelines. My heart pounded with gratitude and fear. This was the evidence I hadn't dared hope for, but it came at a cost. Anna was risking her livelihood to hand it to me. As I stepped outside into the cool air, the noise of the city rushing around me, I realized the battle was shifting from private humiliation to public judgment. Juliet had tried to cloak her greed in respectability, but the cracks were showing. And now I had allies, even unexpected ones. I was not naive. I knew she would strike back harder. But I also knew I was no longer walking alone into the storm. That evening, as I placed Anna's documents into the growing folder of evidence, I noticed something else tucked inside, something I hadn't put there. A folded piece of paper, handwritten, with no signature. The words were brief but chilling. "Be careful. She knows you're preparing more than she expected." The note with no signature stayed on the table while I boiled the kettle and watched the water roll, because I wanted to decide whether to treat it as mischief or warning. And in the end, I treated it as both and took a photo before I slid it into the folder with the same care I had been using on everything that could matter later. And then I called Lydia and told her about Anna and the copies and the unsigned warning and the way Juliet's voice had changed when she realized the judge was not impressed, and Lydia listened, as she always did, and told me to get some rest because the next 7 days would be busy and I would need a clear head. And after we hung up, I stood by the window with moss at my feet and went over the practical steps again. Not to calm myself, but to make sure nothing would be missed, because winning in rooms like the one I had just left did not come from speeches or tears. It came from documents lined up in the right order and from people who could say plain sentences without dodging. The following morning started with a letter from the court listing interim directions, and when I opened it and read the heading, I stopped for a moment and then read it out loud to make sure I was not imagining it. Because there on the first line, the case title had my address correct and my date of birth correct, but the name field did not say Margaret Hart. It said Aurora Hughes, and for a second I felt wrong-footed until the utility of it clicked into place. Because here was a formal paper, carrying a copy and paste error that did not come from the court because the rest of the data was correct, which meant it came from the petitioner's initial application that had been swallowed by the system and then reprinted on the order. And I called Lydia, and she exhaled in a way that sounded like someone seeing a door open where there had been a wall, and she told me that a wrong name in a heading does not void a proceeding by itself, but it becomes a thread, because it suggests that the form was generated from a template used in another case, and that my details had been dropped into someone else's story, and that is a detail judges notice. Not to humiliate anyone, but because it goes to caretaken and to whether this is safeguarding or administration of a person for convenience. And she asked me to bring the envelope so she could add the franking mark to the exhibit bundle to show the chain of custody, and I did, and she put it into a plastic sleeve with a small label in the corner, and that made me feel that the paper would not blow away even if a window opened suddenly. 2 subject access request responses landed that week faster than Lydia had expected. The clinic sent a file of access logs that listed dates, times, user IDs, and IP addresses for every view of my screening record. And in the table there was an entry 2 hours after we had left the appointment that showed access by an external portal user tagged Partner Social Care C with a sub-identifier that read G. Morris and the action view and download, followed by a notation that the document had been shared via secure link, and then, 3 hours later, an entry that said file link revoked by owner. And Lydia highlighted those 2 lines with a thin pen and wrote in the margin that the revocation aligned with the audit email I had seen at home stating that an attachment had been removed. And she said that while the clinic might say that a social care partner had a portal access for coordination, the fact that a download had taken place without my instruction and that the link had then been revoked suggested a recognition by someone that the access might look bad if seen. And that kind of awareness is not the behavior of someone who believes they are following a clean path. Carries responded as well, not with everything, but with enough to matter, including call logs showing outgoing calls to my GP and to the bank branch and a line in a training document that referenced family reporting. And in their email header we saw that the address used for the file transfer portal was the same domain as the clinic's partner tag, and Lydia circled that too. The bank manager met me again for 15 minutes to give me a written note confirming that the guidance manager stamp had been used without sufficient notation and that going forward their staff had been briefed that any boxed consent on forms relating to proxy or third-party arrangements must be annealed by the client next to a definition printed in full. And I carried that note home like a small tool because it was not dramatic, but it was practical and judges like practical corrections. That show institutions are not hiding. Abby at the surgery printed a 1-line letter on headed paper stating that my record now contained a fixed flag requiring a direct verbal check with me before any third-party communication, and she added the date the old consent was destroyed. And those dates lined up with Oliver's apology emails and with Lydia's letters, and I could see the shape of the week in straight lines on the board in Lydia's meeting room. In our last preparation session before the resumed hearing, Lydia asked me to rehearse 3 things, and she said she knew I disliked rehearsals because they can feel like theater, but that these are not performances, they are routes through the brambles. And the first was to answer without decoration when asked whether I feared becoming a burden, and I said yes, because I did, and that I had thought that fear justified accepting help without questions, and that I could see now how that fear had been used to hurry me along. And the second was to explain clearly that I had made an LPA decision after all, but not the one expected, and that I had chosen to appoint a professional attorney for financial affairs, namely Lydia's firm, to act jointly with me now and solely if I lose capacity later, and that I had done it this way not because I wished to exclude my family from my life, but because I had seen how incentives can warp care, and I wanted to remove the prize that my bank balance might look like in their worst moments. And the third was to describe briefly the trust deed we had executed that week. A simple discretionary arrangement into which I had placed the majority of my savings with instructions that distributions be made to pay for my rent and care directly and not through any family member, and that any remaining funds on my death be split between a local refuge and a scholarship fund in Arthur's name at the technical college he loved. And she said that last part was not required by the court, but that it showed the court I was not making decisions from spite, that I was making a plan for my life that removed arguments before they could start. When I told Oliver about the LPA and the trust, I did it at my kitchen table with the green pen between us, because I wanted him to see that I was using it for my own lines. He ran his thumb along the barrel the way his father used to when he was weighing whether to sign a letter or rewrite it, and his face did a small twist that was not quite pain and not quite relief, and he said he had expected me to cut him off. And I told him that cutting someone off is lazy, and that what I had done was harder because it required me to still be his mother without letting him hold the keys, and he cried, quietly, and then he said Gemma had been called into her manager's office and told that a complaint had been received about potential conflicts at a carer's breakfast event, and that she would be moved off any work that touched aging services while an internal review took place at her company, and I said I was not trying to end her job. And he said he understood that sometimes consequences travel further than the person you wanted to stop, and I told him I expected him to come on Sundays without needing a reason, and that if he showed up with his phone in his hand I would give him a cloth and point at the skirting boards. The resumed hearing filled a little public gallery, not because our case was famous, but because people like other people's dramas when they can leave after lunch. And I felt a flicker of anger at the hum in the back row, but then Mrs. Benson took a seat near the aisle with her handbag placed squarely on her lap, and Mr. Callahan sat behind me with a small notebook. And Priya arrived on a break she had no time for and sat quietly like a person visiting a hospital ward, and Abby had sent a letter to the court instead of attending because she could not leave the desk, and it felt like a little civic attendance had gathered around me, and that made the back row feel less like a market and more like a town meeting. The judge asked for short opening remarks from each side, and Lydia's were exactly what she had promised, sober and tidy, explaining that the petition should be dismissed because I had capacity, because less restrictive alternatives were in place, because the application presented a pattern of prearranged control disguised as help, and because documents showed forgery and unauthorized access to health information, and then she sat down and let the paper bundle speak. The judge turned to Juliet and asked about the mailbox footage, and Juliet said she had picked up my post absent-mindedly because she was worried about someone stealing it. And the judge asked her why she had a key to my mailbox, and Juliet said she had borrowed mine with permission, and then looked at me as if to cue me to confirm it, and I said clearly that I had never given her my key. And Priya did not need to say a word because a person's face tells an honest story when a small lie stands in front of it. Lydia called Nina as a witness next, and I felt a jolt because I had not expected her to do more than provide the documents. But Nina walked to the stand in her plain jacket and spoke in a steady voice, stating her name and her job, and that she cleaned the office where the printout had been made, that she had seen the spreadsheet titled Mum Plan, Workstream G, that she had photographed the link to the cloud folder, that she had downloaded copies at the public library and brought them to me, and that she knew she was risking trouble at work, but that she would want someone to do the same for her mother. And the judge thanked her in a way that made me want to weep, because it is rare to watch a small person be seen properly in a room built for larger people. Mr. Callahan went next with a short statement about the guardianship papers misnaming me as Aurora Hughes, and how in his years as an accountant the mistake did not look like a typo, but like a template, because name, address, and birth date do not mismatch in that pattern by accident. And then Lydia introduced the clinic audit log showing access by Partner Social Care CE and the revocation of the file link, and the judge asked Gina, who had been sitting at the side under instruction from the clinic's lawyer, to explain the partner portal and whether a consent record existed for my case authorizing that access, and Gina said there was a general referral pathway agreement with care coordinators. And the clinic's lawyer added that they did not believe any laws were broken, and the judge did not argue law but asked for a yes or no on whether a document signed by me authorized the specific access. And when the answer was no, the judge made a note and asked if the clinic would be willing to send a systems note to all partner users reminding them that portal accesses must be client authorized and that retroactive deletions are not a compliance mechanism, and the lawyer said yes, and I could see their shoulders fall a fraction. Then came the twist I had not foreseen. Lydia had filed a further request the night before for any records of payments between carees and the clinic under the General Referral Pathway Agreement, not to prove a bribe, but to see whether any onboarding fees were linked to referrals. And the clinic's lawyer had replied by email that there were no fees paid by the clinic to carees, but that carees was part of a third-party network administrator who charged agencies an administrative fee per new client onboarding for the use of their scheduling software, and that as part of a promotional program carees staff received non-cash incentives like training vouchers when they hit onboarding targets. And Lydia handed the printout up with a short explanation that while this was not a bag of money under a table, it represented a measurable incentive to recruit clients. And the judge looked at Juliet and asked whether she had known about any onboarding incentives when she pushed me to sign up, and Juliet said no and glanced at Oliver with something like anger for not warning her about a question he could not have predicted. The judge recessed for 20 minutes and returned with a decision that did not try to do everything but did enough. The petition for guardianship was dismissed on the grounds that I had capacity and that there were less restrictive arrangements in place through my newly executed LPA and trust, and the court reserved the right to revisit if credible new evidence arose. And then the judge ordered costs to the petitioners for my legal expenses, not as punishment, but to avoid rewarding hasty applications, and the judge said she was referring the matter of the forged consent to the police for assessment and to the Information Commissioner's Office for review of the clinic's portal processes, and she looked at me and said that the court recognizes that families often blur the line between help and control, but that the law must guard the line. And then she stood and left, and the clerk told us the hearing was concluded. We did not cheer or clap because this was not a cinema, and I did not turn to taunt Juliet because I had not come for sport, but I did stand very straight while I gathered my papers, and then I turned to Oliver and said that he could walk me out if he liked. And he took my bag, and we stepped into the corridor together, and Gemma came toward us and opened her mouth and closed it again, and then said she was sorry, and I said that apology would have to live in actions and not in prepared speeches. And she nodded and put her phone in her bag without me asking. Outside the building, the public part of the story played out in smaller scenes. Mrs. Benson told two people on the bus that not everything that looks like help is help and that they should read what they sign, and Priya returned to the bank and told her manager that the guidance manager stamp needed a policy review. And Abby told the practice meeting that receptionists are not gatekeepers of care, but they are gatekeepers of consent, and that they must say no more often when forms arrive already ticked, and Mr. Callahan brought me a slice of lemon drizzle because he bakes when he is relieved, and Nina sent a text that said simply moss, and then a heart, and I replied that the cat had been fed, and that I would bring biscuits to the library's thank you morning. At home that night, I took the green pen and wrote a letter to the residence committee saying I would attend the next meeting about the emergency fobs and that I would support any sensible system that did not treat older residents as access points for their families. And I put the pen down and wrote a private letter to the grandchildren in a notebook I had bought for that purpose, explaining what had happened in terms that did not smear their parents, but that made clear that independence is something you defend before you need it, and I told Ava that she could choose a recipe for Sunday, and that Theo could pick a film, and that they could ask me any questions they liked. The next weeks were not tidy, because nothing is tidy when pride and shame are involved. The police came and took a statement from me about the GP consent form with the copied signature, and they spoke to the GP and to the clinic and to the notary. And I learned later that they interviewed Gina and that she had a solicitor present and that her employment was terminated by Carrie's pending investigation into data practices that went beyond my case. And I did not feel joy about that because losing a job is hard even for people who make bad choices, but I felt relief that she would not be using other people's lives as stepping stones to targets. The Information Commissioner's Office opened an inquiry file and sent me a letter with a reference number. And the clinic sent me a notice a month later stating they had tightened portal access rules and introduced a client authorization check that could not be bypassed by partners. And those two pieces of paper went into my folder as quiet wins that would help people I would never meet. Oliver asked to come on Sundays and I said yes and meant it, and sometimes he came alone and sometimes he brought the children and sometimes he came with Gemma who stayed for an hour and then left to give us mother and son time. And he told me that couples counseling had been suggested to them by a GP who had nothing to do with mine. And I told him that therapy is a form of housework you do on yourself and that he should attend every session as if it were a meeting with a boss he respected. And he smiled for the first time in weeks and said he would, and I believed him because none of this could survive if we did not try to turn it into something other than a pile of accusations. With Lydia, I finished the paperwork that would make my administrative life easier for the future instead of letting other people do it for me, and we registered the LPA. And she set up a simple prepaid standing order from the trust to my rent and to a small emergency fund I controlled, and she wrote to the will storage service to log the addendum that directed the residue of the trust to the refuge and the scholarship. And she told me that one day I might wish to name a secondary attorney too. work with her if I felt lonely appointing a firm, and I told her I would think about it, and that for now my appointments with her and with her assistant felt like a wall that would not move even if someone pushed. I also did something I had promised myself quietly on the bus after the first court date. I went to the Citizens Advice Office and asked if they needed volunteers who could do numbers and sit with frightened people without making them feel foolish, and they said yes, and I now sit at a desk on Tuesdays and fill forms with people who have avoided them. And I call helplines and listen to scripts and ask to speak to supervisors when the script is not enough, and I have come to love the faces people make when the envelope they feared becomes a letter they understand, and I do not tell them my story unless it helps them in that exact minute, because the point is not to rehearse my pain, it is to stop theirs from getting worse. You will want to know what happened to Juliet in terms of public consequences, and the answer is that reputations do not break like plates even when they should. They thin out and develop cracks, and sometimes they hold soup long enough for dinner, and then they leak. And in her case, the leak started at her own office, where someone had already noticed her habit of referring people to services where she knew staff, and where the referral generated quick starts, and she was moved to a role with less contact with vulnerable families, and she posted online about people misunderstanding good intentions, and about how society does not support carers enough. And she is not wrong about carers needing more support, but she is not the person to deliver that message without choking on it, and I did not engage with her posts, because I am not a participant in her campaign. And when I saw her at a distance outside the school one afternoon, we did not wave, and that felt like a correct distance for now. At the next residence committee meeting, the emergency fobs agenda item came up, and a man tried to push through a rule that only next of kin could hold a duplicate fob for each older resident to reduce misuse by cleaners and tradespeople. And I raised my hand and said that if the building wanted to reduce misuse, it could implement a log-in-log-out key-safe system with unique codes tied to the person accessing, and that next of kin do not automatically equal safe access, and that any rule should be based on function, not on assumption, and Mrs. Benson banged her pen on the table and said she agreed, and that this building had managed perfectly well for years by treating residents as residents rather than as parcels. And the measure was revised to a sign-out system and a set of key safes in the lobby, and I went home with a little smile, because not every fight has to be in a court. There was one last piece that came months later on a weekday morning when I was peeling apples for a crumble before the grandchildren came. The post arrived with a letter from the court stating that the police had decided to caution rather than prosecute for the forged consent, because the form had not resulted in harm, and because the clinic had corrected access and the GP had destroyed the document. And the letter also stated that the court had ordered the petitioners to attend a short educational session on capacity law and undue influence run by a local advocacy group, and I held that letter for a while and then put it away, because I could not decide whether I wanted punishment or learning, and I settled on learning, because if the result of this is two people attending a room where a person explains what consent is and how to respect it, then perhaps something good is being planted where something unpleasant grew. I am not naive about time. I know that in 10 years, perhaps sooner, I may need the kind of care that cannot be debated in my kitchen, and when that time comes, I hope I will be as easy to love as I can be without letting people erase me. And I know that I have already made choices that will save arguments when my mind gets tired, and I am proud of that, and I am proud that I did not allow a plan that was presented as kindness to become the shape of my life, and that I still feed a cat who pretends to own me, and I still drink tea that is too strong because that is how I like it. On Sundays we have a routine that is not saccharine. It is simply a routine, and Oliver comes at noon, and sometimes we cook, and sometimes we sit, and sometimes he asks about Arthur in a way he never did when Arthur was alive. And Ava borrows my scarf and pretends she does not want it, and Theo brings me questions about things he has read online, and we check whether they are true, and Gemma has been coming for the first hour and leaving the rest to us, and once, sitting on the sofa, she said that she had written an email to Gina that she would never send, and that she had gone to a supervision session to talk about why she could not stop managing people even in her sleep. And I told her that some people are good at tidying even when the house is a person, and that they have to learn where to put the broom down. Sometimes, when the house is quiet, I open the file that contains the letters and the orders and the logs, and I look at them to remind myself that this happened and that I kept my place in my own life. And then I close it because that file is not my life either. It is just proof, and proof is important, but it is not love. I am telling you this as a friend would over a long afternoon, because if you ever feel that your life is being reorganized around you in ways that make you smaller, you might want to know that you can step into the middle and ask to see the plan. And you can make your own, and the plan you make may include admitting that you will need help and writing that into papers before someone else writes a different story for you. And if you think that doing so makes you weak, then hear me clearly when I tell you that I agreed to be a burden on paper so that I would not be a burden in practice, and that is what I call dignity. I keep the green pen in the drawer by the sugar because I like to reach for it without looking, and when I open the drawer I see the small burn mark on the wooden table from when a sparkler was placed badly at a birthday party years ago. And I think about how a mark can be a warning or a memory depending on how you look at it, and then I get on with the day because days are what we live in, not hearings or files or speeches, just days.